Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily. That's what we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition. We are in poem 314, Nature Sometimes Sears a Sapling. Now, this is another nature poem. We've seen so many of these. And contrasting as well poem. Here we're going to contrast humans and trees. Our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you worked through our set of introductory comments. I'm hopeful that you worked through our preceding 313 poems. We just finished with 313. I should have been too glad. Now, this is another pain poem, another possible theodicy, the question of why must there be pain and suffering? Now, the comparison with a tree is, of course, age old. Think about, of course, Genesis 3 and the first tree in the Judaic and Christian tradition, right? That tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the whole notion of understanding that's going to stand behind that. Many have seen this poem and the background behind this poem as Emerson and especially his classic essay, Nature, of 1836. And she'll begin with, of course, the word nature. Nature sometimes sears a sapling, sometimes scalps a tree. Her green people recollect it when they do not die. Fainter leaves to further seasons dumbly testify, we who have the souls die oftener, not so vitally. Now, some have read this poem as kind of dark. Some have read this poem as standing behind it certain purposeful, hopeful kind of views of resurrection and redemption. We'll try and see how both can work. Notice she begins with the word nature, a word that she does love, and she says sometimes nature sears a sapling. By the way, sears will only be used one time in her poetry, and it's here. But we do have in poem 73, you'll remember, the royal scar. We'll get to scalping here in a moment, right? Sometimes nature will jack a sapling. In other words, you plant the tree, and then along comes the cold, or whatever, worms or whatever, to destroy it. Sometimes nature will scalp a tree. We're going to see the same scalping in poem 315, scalps your naked soul. And then her green people, that is to say her leaves, we can't see that and the use of the word leaves here without thinking of our Whitman and Leaves of Grass. We call this series Chats with Emily. We called the series at LearnStrong.net before, where we did all of the poems of the deathbed edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We call that Talks with Walt. And here notice she says, the green people recollect it when they do not die. In other words, sometimes nature can wound a tree and yet the tree can come back. Yes? In other words, it doesn't completely die. Fainter leaves to further seasons, this repetition of the F sounds, dumbly testify. In other words, if you are experiencing pain, look to the trees and recognize that sometimes they will lose their leaves and then, of course, return. We can't help but think of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind here, of course, and especially part 5. We've given full lectures at LearnStrong.net. And then from all of this about nature and trees, the word we. And of course, the antecedent to this is much like Jefferson's use of that we in the classic document that Emily loved, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Here, we who have the souls, notice it's not souls, but the souls, as opposed to trees, is she making reference, we die oftener, not so vitally. Now, it's an interesting phrase that she's going to present to us. In what ways do we die more often than trees? Here she could be speaking not about physical death, but maybe about emotional or spiritual death. That is to say, unlike trees that technically only die one time, humans may actually die more often and yet have this tendency to come back. Because why? We have souls, which is to say maybe we have that desire for a return. Now, at 2a, I think that the argument here can easily be made that heaven itself can't be won without the mark of God's malice. The classic scholar Wolfe has made this argument. And Wolfe kind of continues along with the study of Melville's Moby Dick and Ahab. And now I'll quote a few lines from Wolfe because it's so beautiful the way it works. Melville's Ahab, crazed in his attempt to dismember the dismember, is an American Jacob, touched by divine violence and determined to seek out and challenge again and again until mortal combat be done. Quote, this is now Melville, "To the last I grapple with thee," the final speech that Ahab flings upon the wind. And Ahab bears the scar of his first wrestle, the mark of mutilation. Quote, now again Melville, "It resembled that perpendicular seam sometimes made in the straight lofty trunk of a great tree, when the upper lightning tearingly darts down it, and without wrenching a single twig peels and grooves out the bark from top to bottom ere running off into the soil, leaving the tree still greenly alive but branded," end quote. It is not the reassuring lesson of Emerson's nature that informs Dickinson's poetry, but Ahab's lesson, the lesson of Jacob. Heaven itself cannot be won without the mark of God's malice. End quote. And I think that at 2b, the word choices here are powerful. Sears and scalps. That is to say, unlike trees, humans die so many times and then find a way to somehow be resurrected. At 3a, can't help but think of Emerson's classic nature, and obviously as well Melville's Moby Dick. Finally, to own a poem like this, what was a time in your life when you were seared, when you were scalped, and yet somehow your leaves came back and you were able to make it? What is it that Shelley says in Ode to the West Wind, "If winter come, can spring be far behind?" Thank you.